If there is one thing you know about me, I love this city. Louisville, Kentucky raised me, but Atlanta, Georgia transformed me. And after almost 50 years of covering the biggest stories and events that have shaped the city, I'd like to believe I played a small role in transforming it too. Well, every week on the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, I will introduce you to Atlanta's most groundbreaking innovators and influencers, those inspired by the city to make a mark in our world. Hi, everyone. I'm Monica Pearson, and this is the Monica Pearson Show. When you think of Atlanta's most famous, my guest this week is top of the list. He's a world-renowned neurosurgeon and CNN's chief medical correspondent.
We know there's been lots of what are called internalizing symptoms that develop.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, he quickly became an unwavering presence and America's doctor. But to his 3 daughters, he's just dad. Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Welcome to the Monica Pearson Show.
Thank you for that introduction. My mom would be so proud.
You are known as America's doctor, but I want to know about who you were before that. So growing up in Novi, Michigan, as a minority, what was it like?
It was a really small town where I lived, very rural, very homogenous. I think it surprises people because I think they have a sense of sort of what a diverse community would look like. At that time, it was mostly a farming community where I grew up, about 4,000 people. And I think as a result of that, whenever you're the only one who's different, that's going to make you a subject of teasing, of bullying. I think what struck me, Monica, was that it was 1979. I was, about 10 years old. It was the Iran hostage crisis. I'm Indian. I'm not Iranian. But all of a sudden, you are assigned the attributes of whatever demographic is not in favor, not sort of being held up in some way. And so all of a sudden, I became the subject of ridicule for something that was totally unrelated to me. But when you have a different name, you have different color skin, your parents eat different foods, you practice a different religion, and you grow up in rural America, it can be tough.
So how did you fight through it?
When you're young, I think, first of all, you have no context for this. That's the other thing. And keep in mind, again, we're talking the 80s here. So there's no social media. I have no sort of window to the world of how things are supposed to be. So if you're the only brown kid in a white community, you think that's just the way it is. That's the way it is. That's the price you pay. And I think even for my parents, they had more of a sense of it because they were in the working community, so they got a sense of what life was like. But I don't think there was ever a real sort of option to say, hey, look, we should do something about this as opposed to just weather the storm. I will tell you one thing that happened that I think was very emblematic between my mother and I. When I was around that age, I thought that if I changed my name to Steve, and Steve because of Steve Austin, the $6 Million Man, which was my favorite show on television at the time. But I remember thinking as a 6 or 7-year-old kid that if I just changed my name to Steve, that would solve all my problems. That would solve it. And I went to my mom and I said, what do you think? And to my surprise, she said, yeah, sure, why don't you do it? Why don't you do it? We'll sleep on it and then in the morning we'll go do it. And I was sort of a bit shocked. I expected more pushback. But I think in the back of her mind, she knew that if I just thought about it, I probably would not want to carry through, and she was absolutely right. But at that time, that was how I felt, that simply changing my name. It was never about distinguishing yourself. It was always about assimilating yourself. That was how you survived. It was certainly true for me as a kid, but also true for my parents. If you're growing up living in a rural town like that, they lived there because they were both automotive engineers, and that was close to the automotive, auto city.
And your mother, I think at the age of 24, was the first woman engineer hired by Ford. So she was catching it on all fronts.
Yeah, my mom, you'd like my mom, Monica. By the way, she loves you. Who doesn't? You're a legend.
Thank you.
You are a legend. When she comes to visit me in Atlanta, she was watching you as opposed to watching me. It's kind of funny. But No, she really did. And I think in some ways, if you just set yourself up as the person who's always had to overcome something, in her case, because she was a woman wanting to be an engineer.
And she had been a refugee.
And she'd been a refugee. And to this day, and my mom and I are very close, but to this day, I don't think I can fully appreciate what living your most formative years of your life as a refugee really does to somebody. I don't know. Again, we're close, but the idea that if you're a kid in a refugee camp, that your entire life is transactional. Nobody does anything for you. You have to, there's always some transaction that's always taking place. And I think that if you experience that so strongly as a child, as hard as you try when you get older and life is very different, there's still that sort of part of you that, hey, I got to be suspicious of everyone. Nobody here is just my friend. They may do things for me, but they're going to want something in return. And she's a joyous person. She's a happy person. I don't mean to suggest she's not, but that is the sort of lens, I think, at which she looks at the world. When you grow up with a mom like that, who was the first woman in her college in India. She was the first woman to get a job in Germany doing automotive engineering. She came to the United States, was the only woman in the engineering school in Oklahoma. She wore a sari every day in the 60s. They don't wear saris in Oklahoma now.
No.
And so 40, 50 years ago, it was totally, challenging for her. Then she drives cross country to go to the Motor City and basically walks in a sari in the middle of winter and says, I'm here to apply for an engineering job. And I think they must have looked at her like she was from a different planet. But she did it. And she was the first. And there's all these women who followed her as engineers within the automotive industry and all these other industries across the country. The organization called Girls Who Code, I don't know if you've ever heard of this.
Yes.
But when they put out their charter, when they were announcing themselves, they cited my mother as one of their inspirations. So really challenging. We're not a household where I can say, I can't do that. My mom's like, you can't do that? You mean you won't? You mean you're not summoning the energy to do that, whatever it might be? Can't is not a word we were allowed to say very much in our household, not when you have a mom like that.
And your dad, as you said, was an engineer too. What are the life lessons that you now share with your three daughters? And I think your girls are...
I have 18, 16, and 14.
And 14,
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, how are you sharing that information? How are you sharing those family customs, those family feelings, those family ideas, the things that make the Gupta family just that?
It's a great question, and I will say this now as a parent of three teenagers, that it's harder than you might think. I think a lot of people sort of think, well, when I have children, here is our family story, I'm going to impart this on that, there's going to be all kinds of wisdom and lessons that come from that. And that can be true, but I think one of the lessons I learned that I now try to impart is that sometimes you've got to let people arrive at their way of thinking on their own. The more you try and bludgeon it into their heads or whatever, sometimes the more resistance you get. And I don't say that in a way to malign teenagers, but I think with my mother's story, for example, and she has these granddaughters now, I just let them be aware of her story and take from it what they will. And so what I realize a lot of times is just basically telling them, but not sort of preaching it to them, at least in my experience, and I say this with a lot of humility because parenting is hard, but I think if you do that, it's much more likely to stick. And the times when they've come back to me and asked me questions like, what was it like in those refugee camps in India for Dadi, what they call my mom? And I will tell them, I'll answer the questions. But I think, we want to raise strong daughters who look at the world and say, hey, here is places where I think I can make it better. There are options for me. And I don't think there's anything I can't do because I happen to have this woman in our family, my grandmother, who did all these things. So she's at least shown us what is possible. And maybe they follow a completely different path and they don't execute any of that, and that's okay. But I think that they at least have learned that wisdom in their own way.
Which of the three you think will follow you into the business, or will they follow your wife into family law?
The most honest answer is I don't know. I really don't know. My middle daughter, who's 16 years old now, Sky, she is the one that has, I think, shown a real sort of proclivity towards science and medicine. And, you know, I think she really likes the idea. She's come to the hospital with me a few times. She reads a lot of books about this. But she, you know, she may change her mind. Again, she said marine biology the other day. So my oldest daughter is in the world of communication and advertising. She's a college freshman now. And my youngest daughter, we don't know.
She's 14.
She's 14. But I'll tell you, I think the greatest gift, and I don't know if you feel this way about your own family, Monica, but I think the greatest gift we give our children is the gift of options. When my parents came here, they had to make it work. They had to make it work. If they did not make it work, they weren't going to survive here in the United States. So that meant choosing jobs that were going to be more stable. Engineering was a job like that. Medicine was a job like that. Law was a job like that. And that's where, if you look at immigrant populations from the 60s, the vast majority of people at that time, well over half, went into those three professions. When I was born, it was the late 60s. My mom was a very young mom. My dad was even younger than my mom, and it had to work. I had to work, So going into medicine or going into a stable field was always sort of expected, I think, of me.
But what I find fascinating is in high school, you were selected for this pilot program where you go from high school to medical school?
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Did you have a choice? No, I'm serious.
There was the presumption of choice. I think, I think I have free will in these things, although I was 16 years old. What it was a really interesting program, and there was a program at Michigan and a few other schools across the country that basically said for a certain number of students, in our case around 40 students a year, they would say, hey, we'll accept you into medical school out of high school. You got to do a couple years of college so that you're mature enough, to enter. You got to be at least 18 to enter medical school. And I applied and was accepted into that program. I think that one of the goals of the program was this acknowledgement that we were running into primary care doctor shortages. So we said, hey, we are 10,000 primary care doctors short. We think by the year 2020 we'll be 20,000 primary care doctors short, whatever the numbers would be. We want to start really gearing students from around the country to show an interest in primary care. The program doesn't exist anymore in part because it didn't quite work the way they wanted it to. I went into neurosurgery. Right. The program didn't work in large part because it didn't meet its goal of training more primary care physicians. A lot of the people in my class, for example, went into specialty medicine. So on one hand, you had these kids who were, high-performing kids, and I followed this program along for years. They're high-performing kids in high school. They are getting accepted into medical school very early. There is the presumption of choice, although I will say that if you're 16 years old and you're basically told, hey, your life is laid out for you now, you're going to be a doctor, it's pretty alluring just because it's all there. You can see the road forward. I think there were probably kids in that class that should not have gone on to medical school. It just wasn't the right fit for them, so it wasn't for everybody. But for me, I loved it. I love science. I love being a doctor.
That fits the stereotype.
What's that?
The stereotype of Indian people.
I know. Going back again to the 60s, I think there was, here's the thing about the stereotype, is that the stereotype would presume that there were no other interests among this demographic of people. That's not accurate. Why there were so many people who went into medicine was because they had to make it work. They had to have these stable careers, engineering, medicine, and law. And I think that as a result, if you sort of look at the clock, we're talking 40, 50 years ago, there are so many Indian doctors, which was to be expected. And the same thing, by the way, with a lot of other immigrant populations at that time. I think now for the grandkids of that generation, and even the kids of that generation, you start to see more diversity in the professions they choose. Look, when I decided to do television, which my mom, by the way, still calls, you'll appreciate this, my mom still calls it that other thing you do.
That other thing
That
you
other
do?
thing you do. Because she sees me as a doctor, and I am a doctor, but how's that other thing going? That'll be the question she often asks, because in her mind still, from when she was a kid, and her whole thing was, we're gonna make it work, we're gonna make it work. And you've had obviously a very successful career in television, I have as well, but as far as stability goes,
It's not stable.
it's not stable. And so it wasn't about prestige, it wasn't even about money. The criteria that mattered the most was stability. That was it. So pick the most stable things. And I think that was how my parents thought. That is to some degree how I thought. I'm gonna be 55 years old next year. My kids, the great gift I've given them is options. They don't have to think the same way.
Now, you chose neurosurgery. Why?
My decision to do neurosurgery came a little later than most. Many of my colleagues, they've known since they were a kid they want to be a brain surgeon. Oftentimes it was somebody in their life, a parent or somebody else in their life who had great influence over them. But for whatever reason, they decided that brain surgery was a thing for them. When I started medical school, I thought I was going to do pediatrics. I love kids, and I loved my pediatrician, and always made me happy to go see my doctor, which was unusual. I did a neurosurgery rotation, and that I think really kind of showed me that this was a possible career choice. When I was younger, my grandfather, who is my mom's father, had had a stroke. And keep in mind, there's nobody in our family who's a doctor. So I was, as a 13-year-old, I'd go to the hospital to visit him and became really interested in medicine and talking to the doctors and being that annoying 13-year-old who asked a lot of questions. Saw these guys show up in their scrubs and their white coat every day and tell me that they were going to take care of my grandfather and that they were going to nurse him back to health. And I thought, well, that's a job? I mean, just frankly seems like something people should just do, take care of each other. But the idea that it was a job and that they would open up his carotid artery and all these things was fascinating to me. So I think there was these sort of hints of interest early on. But then when I actually did a rotation in neurosurgery, I think I was completely sold. It is the most enigmatic 3.5 pounds of tissue in the known universe. Everything we are, everything we do, everything that will happen, everything that has happened is related to a 3.5 pound tissue mass in our skulls that I have been privileged enough to be able to learn how to operate on, to hopefully make better, to remove tumors and clip aneurysms and remove blood collections. Every time I walk into the operating room, I'm still astounded by it. And I've been doing this for a quarter century now. So I'm still just astounded by the fact that I get to do this at all.
I was listening to some of your podcasts and I was reading, bits and pieces from your books and articles. And you talk a lot about protecting the brain. How do you protect yours?
A lot of the protection of the brain is based on some of the same principles that you use to protect the heart. In fact, oftentimes in medicine, they say what is good for the heart is good for the brain. But what I think we know, just even over the last 10, 15 years, our knowledge of how to actually optimize the brain, prevent disease in the brain, has changed dramatically. 15, 20 years ago, the idea that the brain inside this skull is sort of a black box, you can't manipulate it, it is what it is. You got a certain number of neurons, they're gonna wither away as you get older, and that's it. You drain the cash and that's it. And we know that to not be the case now, based on all sorts of new technologies, ways to image the brain and look at the brain and see how it functions. What I think is interesting is that most of the same things, good diet, good movement, good amount of rest, all those things really apply. But the brain is different as well. I'll give you one example. Everyone knows that you shouldn't eat too much sugar. Right? I mean, that's out there. What does the body do with too much sugar? The body says, oh, all this extra energy, fantastic. I'm gonna store that because who knows when I'm going to eat again. Yeah, I may not eat again. The body is still under this presumption that this meal that I'm eating might be my last meal. Everything is reflexively coordinated around that principle. The brain doesn't think that way. If you start to get a lot of sugar in your bloodstream, and the brain has got all these receptors, it's absorbing energy, as soon as the sugar levels go too high, what the receptors do, they just shut down. So at the same time you're overstuffing your body, you could be starving your brain. That's the visual that I often tell people, and it gives you some sense of how toxic sugar can be to your brain. You're essentially starving your brain by eating too much sugar. I don't think anyone fundamentally understands that. When you move, we know that if you are briskly moving, if you're just moving in life, you tend to make more of these factors that grow new brain cells. It's kind of like you're saying, hey, I want to be here, I'm moving, see? Don't let me die, don't let me get sick, let me be here. If you intensely move, run really hard or swim really hard, that can be really good for your heart health, but it also forces you to make a lot of cortisol, which is a stress hormone.
Belly fat.
And that's belly fat, that's stress, that's high blood pressure, but it also decreases the amount of brain cells you make. So those are two examples of things that are different for the body versus the brain.
So physician, heal thyself. What do you do? What's your diet like?
My diet is solid. It's not perfect, but it's really solid, and it's become more solid over the years. So I eat mostly plants. Occasionally I'll have meat. I limit my calories most days of the week to around 1,500, 12 to 1,500. I allow myself to splurge. You know, look, I got teenagers, I got a wife, we got things we got to go to. I got to hang out with various members of this crew here of yours, and we go out. But I'm diligent about it.
What about exercise?
I exercise every day.
What do you do?
I either swim, bike, or run every day. I like to do yoga with my wife. I'll do some resistance training, you know, I'll add those things in. But swim, bike, or run every day. I mostly, if the weather's not as nice, I'll do an indoor bike, a Peloton or something like that, or run inside. If I can be outside, I prefer that. It's me time. I know it's beneficial for my body and my brain. I know that. I can show you plenty of data as to why that kind of activity is good. But it's me time. I think when I exercise, I often think to myself, I have been able in my busy day to carve out some time to just go do this. And somehow that alone, even aside from the physical benefits of it, the mental benefits, the idea that I can do it at all, it's big for me. It's kind of a reset for me. So if I'm in the middle of a busy day and I'm having writer's block or whatever might be happening, a lot of times I will go do quick exercise. And it doesn't have to be long. Sometimes I'll just go lift weights for a little bit just to get the mind going, do something. But every day, it wasn't like that my whole life. Really, for me, I think this idea of being really diligent about exercise started when I turned 40. It wasn't, I was active, but I was also a kid who didn't have to worry about it. I could eat whatever I wanted. I didn't have to exercise. I had a hard time gaining weight. And then, you get into your 40s and it's not the same. And I said, I'm gonna be serious about this. And I think also my own personal belief is if you're a television doctor, you should probably look the part a little bit, I mean, there are, with all due respect to many of my colleagues who I love and adore, some of them don't look that healthy. And even if you go to your doctor's office, sometimes the people who are preaching to you about what you should be doing, they don't look that healthy. I'm not criticizing as much as saying I did not want that to be me.
So, I think about the things that scare me health-wise. I've had two cancers, breast cancer and liver cancer, and I'm still here because the way I see my body is it's like a car. It breaks down, you fix it, you keep going, and you try to make sure whatever caused the problem doesn't happen again. But what scares me most when I talk about illness, for me, is Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
What is the one disease or condition that you go, God, I don't want that?
I'm right there with you. Alzheimer's. I say this as a neuroscientist, but every time I operate on the brain, part of me does wonder, have I changed this person in some way? Are they going to psychologically think about things differently? Are they going to have lost certain memories, whatever it might be? And that's just from the air hitting the brain. When I think about Alzheimer's, I think it's the one thing that can sort of rob you of, I think, all the things that we hold important. I mean, look, physical ailments, I don't think they're preordained, but they happen. I think that when it comes to your mind, what we realize is that it's not at all preordained that you're going to lose your memory. It's not all preordained that you're going to have this wear and tear of your cognitive function as you get older. There are people who are in their 90s, live to their dying day, whose cognitive function is just as strong as it was decades earlier.
You have traveled so much. Your wife is a saint.
She is. She's going to love to hear that.
She's a saint. But in many ways, COVID had to be a blessing for you because it had you at home and you weren't traveling as much.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. It's always hard to call something that has caused so much destruction in our society a blessing, no matter what. And maybe like you, Monica, I've known people who died.
Yes, too many.
And I just, and I'm in touch with many of their families still on a regular basis. I think you develop these touchstones in your life. Sometimes the strongest touchstones you have in your life are galvanized out of really traumatic events. So strongest relationships I have in my life were formed in places where the world was suddenly turned on its head. And all of a sudden you just had to be with somebody like, what are we gonna do? We have no idea what the path forward is. It's a natural disaster, it's conflict, it's things like that. But to your point, I mean, my girls were I had a freshman, I had a 7th grader, and I had a 5th grader at home at the time. And because I, operate as a surgeon and I travel for all these stories, I didn't get to spend the kind of time that I wanted to with them. I wasn't somebody who had guilt or regrets about it. It's just that's the way life is. But during the pandemic, having that time at home just to be with them was nice. It was very different. And as I joke around with my wife, it was a bit of a litmus test for a marriage as well. I spent more time with my wife in 1 year than we had in nearly the 20 years before. And we still like each other, so that was good, right? I mean, I don't know if that worked out the same for everybody, but in our case, it was a good thing.
So let's talk about those touchstones.
When you cover a natural disaster, and you meet these people in the midst of this, who are probably not that different than you, if you really think about it. They got kids, they went to the ATM machine to take some money out of the bank, they bought their groceries that morning, they got gas, and then the bomb started falling out of the sky, or a hurricane hit, or whatever it might be. It is kind of remarkable to see how different people behave. And sometimes you see people who just rise up. They just rise up. And if you were to ask them a week earlier, a hurricane is going to hit here next week, and you may not believe this, but you're going to be the person who's going to help lead your community. You're going to rise up. They would say, are you kidding me? No way, that's not me. But then all of a sudden, those people do that, and they're these incredible individuals, many of whom I get to interview and spend time with in the aftermath of some sort of terrible thing that has happened. We talk about conflict a lot from afar, sitting in studios and things like that. For the people who actually experience the conflict and are thoughtful about it, what they can teach you, the conversations that you can have with them are really, really profound. So,
You've been embedded.
I've been embedded. I was embedded with a group of naval doctors known as the Devil Docs. And I think about them all the time, Monica. I mean, when I operate here in Atlanta, I go and I operate and I take care of my patient. At no point do I think that I could be killed today for doing this. When you're operating in a war zone, you are often the person who is at tremendous risk to your own life going in to save a stranger. It is the most human of all stories. Today, I will risk my life to save yours. I don't know you. You're a stranger to me. But this is how the world works, and this is how we evolve as human beings, is that Because I have these skills, I save you, even if it means I die, because that's how we evolve and move forward. It's the most human of all stories. It was a story I experienced early on in my career at CNN, and I think in some ways for 20 years, I've been thinking that everything is sort of related to that story still. Every story is about somebody who rose up, who did the right thing, that as a result of their actions moves our society and our evolution forward as opposed to backwards.
I'm seeing a different Sanjay here.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
I like it.
mean, no, I like you as the doctor. And you're very, but there's this warmth about you.
Thank you.
That I really like.
Well, thank you. Hopefully, maybe without 5, 6 cameras here and all this, we can go grab a cup of coffee.
I would love to do that. So what is this with you and the accordion?
And care for each other.
I'll tell you what it is. This is actually relates to everything we've been talking about. My parents, including my mom, refugee camps, the one thing that they did have is they had music. And it was mostly Bollywood music, right? And you know what one of the big instruments in a Bollywood music film is from back then? It's the accordion.
Accordion.
So when my parents came to the United States, they said, our son will play the accordion. It was like, for them, it was a piece of home. For me, it was, can you imagine? So I'm that kid in rural Michigan, the only brown kid, the kid who talks like I do, that eats like I do. By the way, I had an accent until I was about 5 or 6 years old because I just lived at home and my parents have an Indian accent. So I didn't start to lose my accent until I started going to school. So that was another source. And then add to all that the accordion. It's like, it was ridiculous. I mean, really, I wouldn't have done that to anybody. Not their fault. But I kind of grew fond of the instrument over time. It's, you know, it's a nice, it's a very joyous sort of sound that it makes. And
You took lessons for what, 10 years?
I took lessons when I was 10.
Oh.
That
was the last time?
Yeah, that was the last time. But I kept playing, and now I play for my kids and things like that. So, I learned enough, and it's keyboard instruments, so you kind of, if you get the keyboard stuff down, you just got to get the left hand down, which I thought was good training for the surgery part of my life as well. So, got to be a bit ambidextrous playing accordion.
Now, Dr. Ben Carson, Dr. Mehmet Oz, practiced medicine, but then they went into the world of politics.
Yes, they did. You're right.
What about you?
No, thanks. No, thanks.
You were a White House fellow, so you were exposed to the world of politics.
I think there's a difference between politics and public service. I really do. I have great respect for many people in politics. I think the environment has become really toxic. I think the private sector, if you look at medicine, private sector can have a huge impact on public health and medicine and all these things. Public service, I think, is something that I would aspire to again at some point in my life, to do something that was not an electoral politics where I have to run for office and do that, because it just becomes about that. But if I really wanted to make a difference in healthcare, for example, to go to an organization like HHS and say, hey, look, feel free to ignore me, but I've been practicing medicine for a quarter century. I've been a journalist, an investigative journalist, covering these issues for 20 years. I might have some ideas that you might find useful. And here I see problems emerge before other people see problems emerge. That's what a journalist does. I see solutions emerge before other people see that. That's what a journalist does. If there is a shortfall, I think, to journalism is that I don't feel like we can execute on what we've learned. We can tell those stories, and that's really important. But if there was something that I wanted to do was to say, okay, I spent decades learning all this now. Maybe I can be helpful with regard to what I think is a major issue in our country. We spend $4 trillion on healthcare. Life expectancy is going backwards, even before the pandemic. People are more unhealthy than they've ever been, and we're throwing dollar after dollar at a problem that I think is solvable, or at least addressable. And so that I would do again.
What's your favorite way to relax?
Sleep.
How much sleep do you get?
I'm good about sleep. I try and do 7 hours at least. I'm good about it. Look, I told you, my life changed. People have this preconception that, hey, it's a badge of honor to say I slept 5 hours. You are not functioning. You are not working at the top of your game, and you're probably putting people around you at a disadvantage. So I like sleep, and I think if we're always stressed, if there's always some stress in our lives, sleep is perhaps one of the most reliable ways to at least get a break from that stress. If I can, and this may shock you, but I'll even try and squeeze in a nap every now and then.
I was going to ask you if you were a napper.
Somebody convinced me you're of the virtues of napping. So if I can, I'll try and get a nap in.
Okay, what's your favorite way to learn? Do you read? Do you watch? What's your favorite way to learn?
I read. I read a lot. I read a lot of different books. I read a lot of fiction as well as nonfiction.
But you also write fiction too.
I like to write
Yes.
fiction, yes. But I think reading, I do like watching smart, good discussions about things, and certainly, at a time like this in the world, watching from reporters that are on the ground in places who, can just say, hey, look, let me get out of the way, but let me show you what is happening here in Gaza or in Israel, whatever it might be, or even in a courtroom if something big is happening in the world of law. But I think for the most part, reading allows me to absorb things at my own pace. I think some things I want to sort of linger on longer. Other things I can go by faster. So I think when you read, you're the arbiter of how quickly that information is sort of coming to you, and nothing else does that. I mean, you could stop a podcast, you could stop your television, say, let me think about what this guy just said. Reading allows you to sort of do all of that real time.
So what's your favorite way to teach?
By example. I'm a teacher. I teach people in the operating room. I teach my medical students and my residents. And I think in medicine, one of the adages that you may have heard is, it says, see one, do one, teach one.
Teach one.
And I think for when I get new residents and medical students, I just let them watch me operate for a while, and they can just see everything. They can see how it all sort of comes together, the positioning of the patient, the first incisions, whatever you need to do. But I don't let them do it until they've really sort of learned that by example. Same thing with kids. And again, I'll always preface by saying with humility, because parenting is hard, but I think if you set a good example for your kids, even if they don't seem like they're paying attention, they're paying attention. Mm-hmm. Kids are really good at making it seem like they're not paying attention, but they're actually watching you. And my mom taught me that, and I watched her, even if I pretended I wasn't, and I think my kids watch me as well.
Your favorite way to share?
I think my favorite way to share, and I think this has come to light even more so for the last few years, is to just kind of do what we're doing now, having real conversations with people, connecting in this way. We know connection's important. There's plenty of data around that now. But somebody said something to me recently that I really took to heart. And the phrase was, it is hard to hate close up. It is hard to hate close up. And as much inflammation as there is in the world, I'm not saying being together is going to solve all those problems, but the idea that it's easier to hate from afar, and when we actually get together, even with people we don't necessarily agree with, it's hard to hate them close up. So sharing, I think, is about finding that connection and making sure you can find some love for everybody. I think we're not rugged individualists, Monica.
No.
We are reciprocal altruists.
I love that.
That's how our society wins.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gupta, for joining us today. And thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to ajc.com to watch all of our upcoming episodes. See you next time. Thank you. You're just delightful.